3 children from a poor family helped a confused stranger on the street, offering water when they barely had food for themselves. The next morning, dozens of former gang members surrounded their house. What they discovered about the mysterious pendant number 47 would change everything they thought they knew about justice and redemption. Like, if this story moved you, subscribe for more incredible true stories. And comment below what state you're watching from. The hospital bracelet still clung to Nora Whitford's wrist when she turned the corner onto Maple Street, her 3 children trailing behind like exhausted shadows. Evan, 14 and trying to be the man of the house, carried Caleb's backpack while 8-year-old Maisie held her youngest brother's hand. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their neighborhood. But something felt wrong the moment Nora's eyes found their house. The front door hung wide open. Voices echoed from inside. Voices that didn't belong. Nora's steps slowed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dust motes danced in the doorway, disturbed by movement within. The sound of cardboard boxes scraping across hardwood floors made her stomach clench. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and careless, echoed through rooms that had been silent for 3 days, while she recovered from her collapse at the diner where she worked double shifts. "Mom?" Evan's voice cracked, uncertainty bleeding through his attempt at bravery. 3 men emerged from her living room, carrying boxes marked with her late husband's handwriting. They moved with casual arrogance, their urban swagger out of place in this quiet corner of Hawthorne Grove, North Carolina. Designer sneakers, gold chains, and attitudes that filled the small porch like smoke. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the tallest one said, not looking up from the clipboard in his hands. "Legal eviction in progress. Got the papers right here." Nora's legs felt like water. "This is my house. There's been a mistake." "No mistake, lady. Bank called it in. You're behind on payments." His tone carried practiced indifference, like he'd delivered this news 100 times before. The documents he thrust toward her looked official. Too official. With seals and signatures that made her head spin. The medical bills from her husband's cancer treatment had drained everything, but she'd made arrangements. She'd talked to someone at the bank just last week. Across the street, Harper Luz stepped onto her porch, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips. Her elderly face creased with concern as she watched the scene unfold. She'd lived on Maple Street for 30 years, had helped Nora with groceries when Derek was dying, had watched these children grow up in the shadow of medical debt and grief. Her fingers gripped the porch railing, torn between the urge to intervene and the fear of making things worse. Caleb pressed himself against Nora's legs, his small hands fisting in her worn jeans. Maisie stood perfectly still, her young eyes wide and absorbing everything, the way her mother's hands trembled, the stranger's careless handling of their belongings, the neighbors who watched from windows but didn't step forward. A light rain began to fall, creating a gray curtain over the street. The droplets felt cold against Nora's face as she watched another man emerge from inside. This one carrying a wooden box she recognized immediately. Derek's memory box, the one that held his wedding ring, letters to the children he'd never gotten to finish writing, and the small pendant he'd worn throughout chemotherapy. "Please," Nora whispered, the word catching in her throat. "Not that box." The man paused, perhaps hearing something in her voice that his companions had missed, but only for a moment. Then he continued toward the truck parked in her driveway, the box of her husband's last gifts disappearing into the dark interior. Nora's knees buckled. Evan caught her arm, his own hands shaking now. While Maisie made a sound like a wounded animal, Caleb began to cry, not the loud wailing of a tantrum, but the quiet, hiccuping sobs of a child who understood that something precious was breaking. Harper set down her mug with a sharp clink and stepped off her porch, her slippers slapping against the wet pavement. The rain was picking up now, drumming against the roof of the truck, against the cardboard boxes, against the shoulders of 4 people whose world had just collapsed. The men worked faster in the rain, their earlier swagger giving way to efficiency. They wanted to finish and leave, but Nora remained rooted to the sidewalk, watching her life disappear box by box, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to understand how 3 days in a hospital bed had led to this moment. The last thing they carried out was a small table Derek had built for Maisie when she was learning to read. As it disappeared into the truck, something inside Nora cracked completely, and she sank to her knees on the wet pavement, her children gathering around her like shields against a storm that had already swept everything away. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the scent of wet asphalt and the sound of water dripping from gutters. Nora sat on Harper's porch steps, wrapped in a quilt that smelled of lavender and decades of kindness, watching the strangers finish loading their truck. Her children huddled close, each lost in their own version of shock. The men were almost done when Nora noticed something glinting in the grass near the driveway, something small that had fallen from one of the boxes. She stood slowly, her legs still unsteady, and walked over to retrieve it. The pendant was heavier than she remembered, its antique silver surface tarnished, but still bearing the deep engraving of the number 47. Derek had worn it every day during treatment, his fingers worrying the smooth metal when the pain got bad. She'd never asked what it meant. There had been so many other battles to fight. "What is it?" "Mama," Maisie asked, her voice small and careful. Nora turned the pendant over in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the way it seemed to hold warmth even in the cool evening air. The memory of Derek's aftershave drifted through her mind, sandalwood and something crisp that used to cling to his work shirts. She could almost hear his laugh, the deep rumble that had filled their small house with joy even during the darkest months. "I don't know, baby. Something of Daddy's." Evan stepped closer, his young face serious beyond his years. "Mom, remember that man we helped the other day, the one who was sitting by the bus stop?" Nora looked up, pulled from her grief by something in her son's tone. "He had a medal just like that, same number and everything. I remember because Maisie asked him about it." The memory surfaced slowly. 3 days ago, before her collapse, they'd been walking home from school when they found an older man sitting on the curb near the abandoned lot on 5th Street. He'd looked lost, confused, clutching something in his hands while staring at nothing. The children had approached him with the natural compassion that hadn't yet been beaten out of them by the world's cruelty. Jonas Wexley, that had been his name. He'd been dehydrated, disoriented, and despite their own empty stomachs and worn shoes, Evan had given him water from his school bottle, while Maisie talked to him in her gentle way. They'd called for help, waited with him until the ambulance arrived. He kept saying something about having to tell someone, Caleb added, his 5-year-old memory surprisingly clear, about the 47 children. Nora's fingers tightened around the pendant. 47 children. She looked at her own 3, at their 2 thin faces and second-hand clothes, at the way they'd learned to make themselves small in a world that seemed determined to crush them. Harper approached with a steaming mug of coffee, her weathered hands gentle as she pressed it into Nora's palm. "Honey, you and the children can stay with me tonight. We'll figure this out in the morning." But Nora was barely listening. She was staring at the pendant, at the number 47, feeling like Derek was trying to tell her something from beyond the grave. The metal seemed to pulse with warmth against her skin, and when she looked closer, she noticed something she'd missed before, a tiny seam along the edge, as if the pendant could be opened. Her fingernail found the groove and pressed gently. The pendant popped open with a soft click, revealing a small piece of paper folded inside. Written in Derek's careful handwriting was a phone number. Nothing more. No explanation. No context. Just 10 digits that seemed to glow in the fading light. Around them, the neighborhood was settling into evening routines. Porch lights flickered on. The sound of television news drifted from open windows, and somewhere a dog barked at shadows. But Nora felt suspended outside of time, holding a piece of Derek's secret life that might be the key to everything. "Mom!" Evan's voice seemed to come from far away. She looked up to find all 3 children watching her, their faces reflecting the streetlight's glow. Behind them, Harper waited with infinite patience. This woman who had opened her door without question to a family that had lost everything. Nora closed the pendant and slipped it around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart. Tomorrow, she would make that phone call. Tonight, she would hold her children close and try to believe that Derek's final gift might be exactly what they needed. The truck pulled away with a diesel rumble that echoed down Maple Street, taking with it the last physical remnants of their old life. But Nora no longer felt empty. She felt like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, about to discover whether the ground below would catch her or teach her to fly. Morning light filtered through Harper's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floor where the children had slept. Nora had spent the night staring at the ceiling, the pendant warm against her skin. Derek's phone number burned into her memory now, with her children still asleep and Harper bustling quietly in the kitchen. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She stepped onto the back porch, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Santos Merida." Nora's voice caught. She cleared her throat and tried again. "My name is Nora Whitford. I found your number in my husband's things." Silence stretched across the line, so long that Nora wondered if the call had dropped. Then she heard the sound of a chair creaking, a long exhale, and something that might have been a whispered prayer. Derek Whitford's widow, Santos said finally, his voice carrying a weight she couldn't interpret. Jesus, how long has it been? He died 8 months ago. Cancer. The words still felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she'd never wanted to learn. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitford, your husband. Another pause. Longer this time. He was a good man. Better than good. Nora sank into Harper's porch swing, her legs suddenly weak. I don't understand. How did you know, Derek? It's complicated. Santos's voice carried the careful tone of a man choosing his words. Mrs. Whitford, are you and your children safe? Are you somewhere secure? The question sent a chill down her spine. We lost our house yesterday. We're staying with a neighbor, but I don't understand why you're asking about safety. Across town? In a room that smelled of motor oil and strong coffee, Santos Merida set down his phone and rubbed his weathered face. The tattoos on his forearms had faded with age and laser removal, but the memories they represented remained sharp. 16 years since he'd walked away from the life that had nearly destroyed him. 16 years of construction work, community service, and trying to pay debts that couldn't be measured in money. The number 47 had been haunting him for months. It was the last name on a list he'd kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. A list of people who had shown mercy when they had no reason to, who had planted seeds of hope in ground that had seemed permanently barren. Each number represented a debt of honor, a promise made in the shadow of redemption. Derek Whitford had been number 47. Mrs. Whitford, Santos said carefully, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The debt your husband was owed has not been forgotten. But if something happened to your house, if someone forced you out, there might be more going on than meets the eye. I don't understand what debt. Ma'am, has anyone approached you about selling the property? Anyone offered to buy it for cash? Maybe at a price that seemed too good to be true? Nora's mind raced back to the conversation with the bank representative, the confusion over paperwork, the men who had seemed too eager to clear out her house. The bank said we were behind on payments, but I made arrangements. Someone was supposed to call me back. Santos closed his eyes. He'd seen this pattern before, in other neighborhoods where desperate families became targets for legal theft. The sick and grieving were easy marks for predators who specialized in paperwork fraud and bureaucratic intimidation. Mrs. Whitford, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to trust me. Did your children help an older man a few days ago? A man named Jonas Wexley? Nora's breath caught. How did you... Yes, they helped him when he was confused and dehydrated. They called for an ambulance. That man was investigating housing fraud in your area. He'd been tracking a network that targets families like yours, people dealing with medical debt, recent loss, situations that make them vulnerable. Jonas was trying to protect people, and someone wanted him stopped. The words hit Nora like cold water. Are you saying someone deliberately? I'm saying your children may have saved the life of someone who was trying to save yours. And Mrs. Whitford, the debt I mentioned, the one your husband was owed. It wasn't money. It was protection. It was a promise. Nora gripped the phone tighter. Through the window, she could see her children beginning to stir on Harper's living room floor. Evan stretching his long limbs. Maisie rubbing her eyes. Caleb curled around the stuffed bear that had survived yesterday's devastation. What kind of promise? She whispered. The kind that doesn't expire when a good man dies. Santos said, Mrs. Whitford, we're coming to help, and we're not coming alone. The line went dead, leaving Nora staring at the phone with her heart hammering, and Derek's pendant heavy against her chest. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of engines starting, the rumble of vehicles beginning to move through the streets of Hawthorne Grove, like storm clouds gathering before rain. The first truck appeared at sunrise, a weathered Chevy that pulled quietly to the curb across from where the Whitford house stood empty. Its engine ticked softly as it cooled, the only sound on the still sleeping street. 20 minutes later, a van followed, then a Camaro with primer spots, then a pickup truck with paint-splattered sides. One by one, vehicles filled the available parking spots on Maple Street, with the careful precision of men who understood logistics and timing. Santos Merida climbed out of the first truck, his gray hair catching the early light. At 53, he moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had learned to channel old instincts toward new purposes. Behind him came Buddy Ramos, whose gentle eyes belied the network of scars across his knuckles, and Miguel Santos, who had traded gang colors for a mechanic's coveralls years ago, but still read a neighborhood's dangers like others read street signs. They didn't swagger, they didn't posture, they simply existed on the street with quiet authority. acknowledging the nervous glances from early rising neighbors with respectful nods. Harper Luz watched from her kitchen window as more men arrived, 14 in total. Ranging in age from early 30s to late 50s, they gathered near Santos's truck without fanfare, speaking in low voices that didn't carry beyond their circle. She noticed how they positioned themselves naturally to watch all approaches to the street, how their eyes tracked movement without obvious staring. These men had learned watchfulness in harder schools than most. "Mom, who are those people?" Evan asked, pressing his face to the window beside her. Nora joined them, her stomach tight with apprehension and something that might have been hope. "I think they're here to help us." Santos separated from the group and crossed the street, his approach unhurried and non-threatening. When he knocked on Harper's door, his knuckles barely whispered against the wood. "Mrs. Whitford, I'm Santos Merida. We spoke on the phone." Up close, Nora could see the deliberate calm in his weathered face. The way his hands stayed visible and relaxed at his sides, he wore work boots and jeans, a flannel shirt with oil stains at the cuffs, and a bearing that suggested both capability and restraint. "You said we," Nora managed. "I didn't expect. 16 men, ma'am. All of us owe your husband a debt we can't repay with money." Santos glanced toward her children, his expression softening. "But we can pay it with protection, with justice, and with making sure his family doesn't face this alone." Maisie stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you the good guys or the bad guys?" Santos knelt to her level, a smile creasing his stern features. "We used to be the bad guys, little one. That's how we learn to recognize the real bad guys when we see them." Across the street, Buddy Ramos was setting up a folding table next to his van, spreading out papers and laptops with practiced efficiency. Others had opened toolboxes that revealed not weapons but cameras, recording equipment, and legal documents. These men had come prepared for war, but it was a war fought with evidence and organization rather than violence. "Mr. Santos," Harper interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of age and neighborhood sovereignty. "I don't know what kind of trouble is brewing here, but these children have been through enough." "Yes, ma'am, and that's exactly why we're here." Santos stood, his hands clasped respectfully behind his back. "Mrs. Luz, we're not here to bring trouble. We're here to end it, legally and quietly." From down the street came the sound of another vehicle, a sedan that moved too slowly, its occupants clearly surveying the changed landscape of Maple Street. It passed twice before disappearing around the corner, but not before Santos and his men had noted the license plate, the number of passengers, and the way the driver's shoulders tensed when he saw them. "That's them," Caleb whispered, pressing close to his mother. "That's the car that's been driving by our house." Santos's expression didn't change, but Nora caught the subtle signal he sent to his men, a slight adjustment of his stance that caused several of them to shift position almost imperceptibly. Whatever storm had been gathering around the Whitford family, it had just encountered an unexpected break wall. "Mrs. Whitford," Santos said quietly, "we'd like to ask you some questions about your house, your husband's work, and the people who contacted you from the bank. Would that be all right?" Nora looked at her children, then at Harper, then back at this man who claimed to owe her dead husband a debt of honor. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last of the dew and promising another day of uncertainty. But for the first time since Derek's diagnosis 2 years ago, she felt like she wasn't facing that uncertainty alone. "Yes," she said, "I think that would be all right." Word traveled fast on Maple Street. By mid-morning, neighbors who usually hurried past with barely a nod found reasons to linger on porches and sidewalks. Drawn by the quiet activity surrounding the abandoned Whitford house, Santos and his men worked with methodical care, documenting everything, but their presence had unlocked something in the community, a willingness to speak truths that had been whispered only behind closed doors. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down was the first to approach. She clutched a manila folder against her chest as she walked toward Buddy's makeshift command center, her steps hesitant but determined. "Excuse me," she said, her accented English careful and clear. "I think I have something you should see." The letter in her folder bore the same official-looking seal that had appeared on Nora's eviction notice. Mrs. Chen's hands shook slightly as she explained how similar men had visited her last month, claiming her property taxes were in arrears, and offering to help her resolve the situation with a quick sale to an investment company. "I called the tax office," she said. "My taxes are current. They have been current for 15 years. But these men, they had papers that looked so real." Buddy photographed each document while Miguel took careful notes. Their questions were gentle but thorough, designed to build a picture without intimidating the elderly woman. As Mrs. Chen spoke, her fear gradually gave way to anger, righteous indignation at being targeted for her age and accent. For the assumption that she could be easily confused or manipulated, within an hour, 3 more neighbors had joined the impromptu gathering. Mr. Clancy, who had lived on the street since the 1960s, brought a logbook where he'd been recording license plates of suspicious vehicles that had been circling the neighborhood for weeks. The Williams family, who ran a small daycare from their home, shared their story of being approached by city inspectors who had questioned their licensing with an aggressiveness that felt more like intimidation than regulation. Santos listened to each account with the focused attention of someone building a case. These weren't random crimes of opportunity. They were part of a coordinated campaign, targeting a specific demographic in a specific area: elderly residents, single parents, families dealing with medical debt or recent loss, people who might be too overwhelmed or too isolated to fight back effectively. Caleb had stationed himself near Buddy's table, fascinated by the older man's patient explanations of how evidence was collected and organized. Buddy had noticed the boy's bright eyes and careful questions, and had begun teaching him to observe without fear, to notice details without making himself a target for unwanted attention. "See how Mr. Santos positions himself?" Buddy murmured to the 5-year-old. "He can see the whole street, but he doesn't look like he's watching. That's a skill, little man, knowing how to be aware without being obvious." Evan had found his own role as unofficial liaison between the adults and the neighbors, who were still nervous about approaching the group. His height and serious demeanor made him seem older than 14, and people responded to his earnest questions with more openness than they might have shown the intimidating strangers who had descended on their street. Maisie, meanwhile, had appointed herself as Santos's shadow, following him with the unshakable confidence that only 8-year-olds possessed. She peppered him with questions about everything from the tattoo removal scars on his forearms to his opinion on whether cats were smarter than dogs. And somehow her chatter seemed to put the nervous neighbors at ease. "My daddy used to say that helping people was like planting seeds," she told Santos as they walked toward another house where a resident had signaled interest in talking. "You don't always get to see them grow, but they grow anyway." Santos paused in his stride, something in the child's casual wisdom hitting him harder than expected. Derek Whitford had indeed planted seeds in the lives of men like Santos who had been drowning in violence and hopelessness, until a moment of unexpected grace had given them reason to believe in redemption. "Your daddy was a wise man," Santos said softly. "I know," Maisie replied with absolute certainty. "That's why he sent you to help us." By noon, the picture was clear. At least 12 families on a 6-block radius had been approached with variations of the same scam: property tax irregularities, zoning violations, urgent health code issues, all fabricated problems with conveniently available solutions that involve selling to the same investment group at below-market prices. Santos stood in Harper's driveway, surrounded by folders full of evidence and the growing crowd of neighbors who had found their voices. The sedan had made 2 more passes, each time slowing when the driver saw the continued presence of Santos's men and the expanding gathering of residents. "Tomorrow," Santos announced, his voice carrying to every person on the street, "we're going to City Hall. We're going to bring everything we've found, and we're going to make sure the right people hear about it." Nora felt her chest tighten with anxiety. Public speaking had never been her strength, and the thought of confronting officials with accusations she barely understood made her want to hide. But then she felt Derek's pendant against her heart, warm with the heat of her body and the love that had put it there, and she looked at her children, who were watching her with the absolute faith that mothers could fix anything, could protect anyone, could move mountains with nothing but love and determination. "Yes," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll be there." Harper's garage had been transformed into something between a war room and a community center. Folding tables lined the walls, covered with documents that told the story of a neighborhood under siege. Maps marked with colored pins showed the pattern of targeted properties, while timelines traced the progression of fraudulent contacts and suspicious vehicle sightings. The smell of strong coffee mixed with the lingering scent of motor oil, creating an oddly comforting atmosphere of focused work. Santos stood before a whiteboard, pointing to a web of connections that grew more complex with each piece of evidence. The investment company listed on all the fraudulent purchase offers led to a shell corporation, which led to another company, which eventually disappeared into a maze of paper entities designed to obscure rather than illuminate. "Classic pattern," Miguel explained to Nora as she studied the documents spread before her. They target vulnerable communities, create artificial urgency with fake legal problems, then offer solutions that happen to involve signing over property rights. Evan sat cross-legged on the floor, reading through pages of city inspection reports that didn't match the dates or signatures they should have contained. His young mind processed information with a clarity that sometimes made adults uncomfortable, finding discrepancies and inconsistencies that had taken the men hours to identify. "Mom," he said quietly, "remember when you got that call from the bank? The woman who said she was returning your call. But you had never called them." Nora's stomach clenched at the memory. She had been so confused, so overwhelmed by Derek's medical bills and her own exhaustion, that she had simply accepted the woman's explanation that there had been a miscommunication about her payment plan. "That was the hook," Buddy said gently. "They needed you to believe there was already a problem so they could offer to solve it." Across the garage, Maisie was helping an older man named Roberto organize photographs into chronological order. Roberto's weathered hands shook slightly as he worked, a tremor left over from years of substance abuse that had ended 12 years ago when he'd made the decision to get clean. His sobriety hadn't erased the damage to his nervous system, but it had given him a precision of mind that made him invaluable at detailed work. "Your little girl has a good eye for patterns," he told Nora. "She spotted something in these surveillance photos that we all missed." Maisie beamed at the praise, then pointed to a series of images taken over several days. "See? Same man, different cars, but he wears the same watch in all of them. Daddy taught me to notice things like that when we played detective games. The detail was subtle. A distinctive silver watch that caught the light the same way in photos taken from 3 different vehicles. It was the kind of observation that could link seemingly separate incidents, the thread that might unravel the entire operation." Santos felt his chest tighten with an emotion he didn't have words for. These children had been shaped by loss and hardship, but also by a father who had taught them to see clearly, to think critically, to notice the details that others missed. Derek Whitford's legacy was walking around on 8-year-old legs, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of complex problems. A soft knock on the garage door interrupted the quiet hum of work. Harper answered it to find Jonas Wexley leaning heavily on a hospital-issued cane, his face pale but determined. "I heard you might need some help," he said. The man who had collapsed 3 days earlier looked fragile but resolute. His investigation into housing fraud had been interrupted by what doctors suspected was a deliberate poisoning. Nothing traceable, nothing that could be proven, but a sudden illness that had silenced him at a crucial moment. Now he was here, carrying a briefcase full of documents that represented months of careful research. "Jonas," Nora breathed, recognizing him from the children's description. "You look like hell." He managed a weak smile. "Feel like it too. But I owe your kids my life, Mrs. Whitford, and I owe this community some answers." The briefcase contained copies of bank records, real estate transactions, and correspondence between city officials and the mysterious investment group. Jonas had been methodical in his investigation, following paper trails and documenting connections with the thoroughness of someone who understood that fraud prosecutions lived or died on the quality of evidence. "They got sloppy," Jonas explained, pointing to a series of emails that had been inadvertently copied to the wrong recipients. "Somebody in the city clerk's office has been backdating inspection reports and fabricating code violations. The same somebody who's been feeding property information to the scammers." Santos studied the emails, his expression growing darker with each page. The corruption went deeper than they had suspected, involving not just street-level con artists, but officials with access to city records and the authority to create legal-looking documents. "How do we prove it?" Nora asked. Jonas looked around the garage, taking in the careful organization, the methodical documentation, the faces of people who had found their courage. "Mrs. Whitford, I think we already have. The question is whether we can get someone in authority to listen." Santos met his gaze across the table. "Tomorrow's city council meeting, public comment period, will make them listen." As if summoned by the mention of tomorrow's confrontation, the sound of a slow-moving vehicle drifted through the garage walls. Santos held up a hand for silence as they listened to the car pass, pause, and pass again. When the sound finally faded, he turned back to the group. "They know we're onto them," he said quietly, "which means tomorrow may be our only shot at making this public before they disappear." Nora felt Derek's pendant warm against her skin, as if her husband's spirit was trying to give her strength for what was coming. Around her, the garage hummed with quiet determination. Ex-gang members, elderly neighbors, her children, and a sick man who had risked his life for people he barely knew. It was an unlikely army, but it was her army, and tomorrow they would go to war. The threats began at midnight. Nora woke to the sound of gravel hitting Harper's bedroom window, a gentle tapping that could have been rain if the sky hadn't been clear. She lay still in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic scatter of small stones against glass, counting the spaces between impacts like a Morse code she couldn't decipher. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than the sound had been. Harper's house creaked around them, settling into the night with the familiar complaints of old wood and older foundations. But tonight, every sound carried weight. The refrigerator's hum seemed too loud. The furnace clicking on made Nora's heart jump. Even the children's breathing, soft and steady from their makeshift beds on the living room floor, seemed amplified in the charged air. At 2:17 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. People who ask too many questions sometimes forget to look both ways before crossing streets. Nora deleted the message with shaking fingers, but the words had already burned themselves into her memory. The threat was vague enough to be untraceable, specific enough to be terrifying. She thought of her children walking to school, of crosswalks and busy intersections, of how easy it would be for an accident to look like an accident. Santos couldn't sleep either. He sat in his truck across the street, radio turned low to a late-night talk show that kept him company, while he watched for movement in the shadows. The other men had volunteered to take shifts, but he couldn't ask them to shoulder a burden that felt so personally his to bear. Derek Whitford had saved his life 16 years ago, and now Derek's family was in danger because Santos had chosen to honor that debt. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent decades learning to read the language of intimidation, to recognize the subtle escalation of threats that preceded violence. Now he was watching that same pattern unfold around people who had no experience with such darkness, no tools to protect themselves except their courage and his promise. At 3:30, a car drove past Harper's house with its headlights off, engine barely audible above the ambient noise of the sleeping neighborhood. Santos memorized the silhouette, the way it moved, the fact that it paused for exactly 7 seconds before continuing down the street. Professional surveillance, the kind that came with training and resources. Inside the house, Evan had given up on sleep and was sitting by the window with a notebook, writing down license plate numbers and times like his mother had taught him during their walks through the neighborhood. At 14, he understood more about their situation than Nora wanted him to, but there was no protecting him from reality anymore. The best she could do was teach him to be smart about danger instead of paralyzed by it. Maisie slept deeply. Her small hand curled around the stuffed bear that had survived yesterday's eviction, but even in sleep she seemed to sense the tension. Her dreams were full of men in shadows, of her father's voice calling to her from places she couldn't reach, of numbers that glowed like secret messages in the darkness. By morning, the psychological pressure was working exactly as intended. Nora's hands shook as she poured coffee, her appetite gone, her concentration fractured. The men outside maintained their protective presence, but even their reassuring competence couldn't erase the creeping certainty that unseen eyes were watching, that unseen hands were planning. Harper moved through her morning routine with the determined normalcy of someone who had lived through harder times than this. But Nora caught her checking the locks twice, noticed how she positioned herself between the windows and the children without seeming to. "They're trying to break our nerve," Santos explained when Nora voiced her fears. "It's cheaper than violence, cleaner than confrontation. They want us to back down before tonight's meeting." "What if they're right to want that?" Nora whispered. "What if I'm putting everyone at risk for a house I've already lost?" Santos studied her face, seeing the exhaustion and fear that threatened to undermine everything they had built. "Mrs. Whitford, this was never just about your house. Your husband knew that. He knew that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies not because you can win, but because someone has to try." Buddy appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "We've got a problem. Jonas just called from the hospital. Someone broke into his apartment last night, tossed the place, took his computer and backup drives." The news hit like a physical blow. Jonas's evidence had been their ace in the hole, the documentation that could prove the scope of the conspiracy beyond any doubt. Without it, they would be going into tonight's meeting with nothing but testimonials and theories. "Did they get everything?" Nora asked. Buddy's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "Jonas is paranoid. Spent 20 years as an investigative journalist before he retired. He's got copies of everything stored in 3 different locations, plus a safety deposit box at the bank." Relief flooded through Nora, followed immediately by renewed determination. If the other side was getting desperate enough to risk breaking and entering, it meant they knew how strong the evidence was. It meant they were afraid. As the day wore on, neighbors stopped by with offerings of support. Mrs. Chen brought homemade soup. The Williams family offered to watch the younger children during the meeting. Mr. Clancy presented Nora with a folder of photographs he'd been taking of suspicious vehicles all week. Each gesture was small, but collectively they represented something powerful, a community that had found its voice. For too long, the residents of this neighborhood had been isolated in their individual struggles, vulnerable because they faced their problems alone. Now they were connected, informed, and angry in the way that decent people get angry when they realize they've been systematically victimized. At sunset, Santos gathered his men for a final briefing. Tonight would determine everything. Either they would expose the conspiracy publicly and force official action, or they would be dismissed as troublemakers and conspiracy theorists, leaving the field clear for their opponents to finish what they had started. No matter what happens, he told them, we protect the family. That's why we're here. That's why Derek would have done for any of us. Nora stood at Harper's living room window, watching the men prepare for what might be their last stand. Derek's pendant felt warm against her heart, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice, steady and sure, and completely unafraid. Trust them, he seemed to say. Trust yourself. Some fights are worth having, even when you're not sure you can win. The municipal building squatted like a gray fortress under the fluorescent streetlights, its brutalist architecture designed more for intimidation than inspiration. By 7 p.m., a steady stream of residents flowed through the main entrance, drawn by word-of-mouth networks and social media posts that had transformed a routine city council meeting into something approaching a community uprising. Nora sat in the third row, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. The pendant felt heavy around her neck, Derek's last gift anchoring her to a courage she didn't feel but was determined to display. Around her, the familiar faces of Maple Street neighbors mixed with strangers from across Hawthorne Grove, other victims of the housing scam who had found their voices in the shared recognition that they were not alone. Santos and his men occupied strategic positions throughout the room, their presence both protective and symbolic. They had traded their work clothes for the kind of respectful attire that spoke of people who understood the importance of the moment. Pressed shirts, clean jeans, the bearing of men who had learned hard lessons about the difference between being intimidating and being respectable. At a table near the front, Jonas Wexley arranged his reconstructed evidence with shaking hands. The break-in had rattled him more than he wanted to admit, but his journalist's instincts had kicked in with the familiar comfort of adrenaline and purpose. Beside him, Buddy photographed each document as Jonas laid it out, creating a real-time backup of everything they were about to present. The city council members filed in with the practiced indifference of officials who had presided over hundreds of such meetings, their expressions suggesting they expected nothing more challenging than the usual complaints about potholes and parking meters. Mayor Davidson, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the soft look of someone who had never missed a meal, called the meeting to order with perfunctory efficiency. "We'll begin with public comments," he announced, consulting his notes. 3 minutes per speaker. Please keep your remarks germane to city business. Nora felt her throat close. 3 minutes to explain a conspiracy that had taken weeks to uncover, to make people care about problems that affected families they'd never met, to somehow transform the raw data of fraud and corruption into something that demanded action rather than bureaucratic delay. She stood on unsteady legs as her name was called, walking to the podium with the measured steps of someone approaching their own execution. The microphone squealed briefly as she adjusted it, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room like a warning. "My name is Nora Whitford," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 8 months ago, my husband died of cancer. 3 days ago, strangers walked into my house and took everything my family owned." She paused, looking out at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some already showing signs of impatience. In the third row, Evan gave her a thumbs up, his young face serious but encouraging. "I thought it was my fault," Nora continued, her voice growing stronger. "I thought I had missed payments or forgotten deadlines. I thought grief had made me careless. But I was wrong. My family was targeted because someone thought we would be too scared or too broken to fight back." The room had grown perfectly still. Even the council members were listening now, their boredom replaced by something like attention. "My children helped a sick man 3 days ago, a stranger who was lying on the sidewalk, confused and dehydrated. They gave him water and called for help because that's what their father taught them to do, to help people who need help, even when you don't have much to give. Nora's hand went to the pendant at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar weight. That man was investigating housing fraud in our neighborhood. The same people who stole my house have been targeting elderly residents, single parents, anyone they think won't be able to fight back. They forge documents, create fake emergencies, and use the authority of official-looking paperwork to steal people's homes. She gestured toward Jonas, who had risen unsteadily from his chair. This is Jonas Wexley. He has documentation proving that someone in city government has been helping these criminals by providing access to property records and creating fraudulent inspection reports. A murmur ran through the crowd as Jonas began distributing copies of his evidence to the council members. Mayor Davidson's expression had shifted from boredom to something approaching alarm as he scanned the documents. Mrs. Whitford, Councilwoman Rodriguez interrupted. These are serious allegations. Do you have proof? She has us, Santos said, rising from his seat in the back of the room. His voice carried easily through the chamber, calm and absolutely certain. 16 men who owe her husband a debt of honor, men who spent years taking from communities like this one, and who have spent more years trying to give something back. One by one, the other men stood, Miguel with his mechanic's calluses, Buddy with his gentle eyes and scarred hands, Roberto with his trembling fingers and steel determination. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their presence was statement enough. We are here. We remember. We stand with this family. The council chamber had become something between a courtroom and a church, charged with the electricity of a community that had found its voice. In the audience, Mrs. Chen clutched her own folder of evidence, while Mr. Clancy held up a photograph of one of the suspicious vehicles that had been circling their neighborhood for weeks. These people, Nora said, her voice now carrying to every corner of the room, came to protect my children because their father once protected them. They came because sometimes the only way to pay a debt is to pass it forward. And they came because a good man taught them that the strong have a responsibility to protect the weak. Mayor Davidson was whispering urgently to the city attorney, their conversation too low to be heard, but tense enough to be felt. In the audience, smartphones had appeared, recording everything for social media networks that would ensure this moment reached far beyond the municipal building's gray walls. I don't know if we can get our house back, Nora concluded. I don't know if the people who targeted us will face justice, but I know that my children will grow up understanding that when someone needs help, you help them. And I know that when bad people try to hurt good families, sometimes, if you're very lucky, the good families don't have to fight alone. She stepped back from the microphone to applause that started scattered and grew into something sustained and powerful as she returned to her seat. Evan reached out to squeeze her hand, his eyes bright with pride and tears. The real work was just beginning, but the hardest part, finding the courage to speak, was done. Now it was up to the system to decide whether justice was still possible in a world that seemed designed to favor predators over their prey. Outside, the first TV news truck was already pulling into the parking lot. The municipal building's parking lot had transformed into an impromptu media circus by the time the council meeting moved into closed session. Local television crews mixed with newspaper reporters and citizen journalists with smartphones, all drawn by the spreading story of a community's stand against systematic fraud. The harsh glare of camera lights turned the gray building into something almost cinematic, while news vans with satellite dishes created a technological forest where Hawthorne Grove residents gathered to compare stories and share evidence. Nora found herself at the center of a careful storm of questions. Microphones and concerned faces. Santos stood protectively nearby, his weathered features calm under the scrutiny of cameras that kept trying to frame him as either a threat or a redemption story. The reality, as always, was more complex than any narrative arc would allow. Mrs. Whitford, called a young reporter with nervous energy and an expensive haircut, what made you decide to trust these men? Their backgrounds, their history. The question hung in the air like a challenge, carrying implications that made several of Santos's men shift uncomfortably. This was the moment that could transform their story from community triumph to criminal sympathy, depending on how it was answered and edited and broadcast. Nora looked at the reporter, then at Santos, then at her children who stood pressed close against her sides like shields against the overwhelming attention. Evan's young face showed the careful wariness of someone learning to navigate adult complexities, while Maisie watched everything with the bright curiosity that hadn't yet been dimmed by too much exposure to the world's cruelties. I trusted them, Nora said slowly. Because my husband trusted them. Because they showed up when no one else would. Because they used their knowledge to protect people instead of hurt them. She paused, feeling Derek's pendant warm against her chest. Because sometimes the people who understand darkness best are the ones who fought their way back to light. Santos felt something tighten in his chest at her words. 16 years of construction work, community service, and careful rebuilding of a life that had once been defined by violence and desperation. And this exhausted woman in a borrowed coat had just articulated his redemption better than he ever could have. Inside the building, the city council was discovering that their closed session had become anything but private. Jonas's documentation had created a paper trail that led directly to Deputy Clerk Morrison, whose access to property records and ability to generate official-looking documents had made the fraud possible. Phone logs, email records, and bank deposits told a story of corruption that was both sophisticated and ultimately sloppy in the way that most crimes became when greed overcame caution. Police cars arrived with unusual speed for a city government that typically moved with bureaucratic lethargy. Detective Maria Santos, no relation to Santos Merida despite the shared surname, emerged from the lead vehicle with the focused energy of an investigator who understood that media attention could either help or hurt a criminal case, depending on how quickly and professionally it was handled. Mrs. Whitford, Detective Santos approached the group with careful respect. I'd like to talk with you about filing formal charges. What happened to your family appears to be part of a pattern we've been investigating for several months. The admission that law enforcement had been aware of the problem sent a ripple of anger through the gathered crowd. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her elderly frame radiating indignation despite her mild appearance. You knew this was happening to families and you did nothing, she demanded. Detective Santos had the grace to look uncomfortable. We had suspicions but couldn't get victims to come forward. People who lose their homes often feel ashamed, isolated. They don't realize they're part of a larger pattern. That's exactly what these criminals were counting on, Jonas added, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades investigating systemic corruption. They target people who are already vulnerable, already overwhelmed, people who are more likely to blame themselves than fight back. The conversation was interrupted by movement from inside the building. Mayor Davidson emerged with the careful stride of a politician, trying to look decisive while actually being terrified, followed by the other council members, and what appeared to be several state investigators, who had somehow materialized during the closed session. Ladies and gentlemen, the mayor announced, squinting in the television lights, the city council has voted unanimously to launch a full investigation into the allegations presented tonight. We are also calling for the immediate suspension of Deputy Clerk Morrison pending criminal charges. A cheer went up from the crowd. But Santos noticed that celebration was tempered by wariness. Political promises made in front of cameras had a way of disappearing once the media attention moved elsewhere. Evan tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing toward a familiar sedan that had just pulled into the far edge of the parking lot. The same vehicle that had been circling their neighborhood for days, now sitting with its engine running and its headlights off in the growing darkness beyond the media's reach. Santos followed the boy's gaze and felt his old instincts sharpen into focus. The investigation might be moving forward, but the people behind it weren't finished. They had too much invested in their operation to simply walk away because of one night's bad publicity. Detective Santos, he called quietly, drawing her attention to the distant vehicle. She followed his gesture, her expression hardening as she recognized the same pattern of surveillance that had been reported in other neighborhoods. With a gesture to her backup officers, she began moving toward the sedan, with the purposeful stride of someone prepared for resistance, but the car pulled away before she reached it, disappearing into the maze of suburban streets, with the practiced ease of people who knew the area well and had planned multiple escape routes. As the crowd began to disperse and the television crews packed their equipment, Nora found herself standing with Santos and her children under the harsh parking lot lights, feeling simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. They had won something tonight, though exactly what remained to be determined. What happens now? She asked. Santos looked toward the place where the sedan had disappeared, then back at this woman who had found courage she didn't know she possessed. Now we wait and see if the system keeps its promises, and we stay vigilant, because people who've built empires on fraud don't usually give up easily. Derek's pendant caught the light as Nora nodded, its surface reflecting the camera flashes and streetlights like a small beacon in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had spoken truth to power, and found that their voices could carry farther than they had ever imagined possible. The real test would come in the morning, when the cameras were gone and the hard work of rebuilding began. Spring had arrived early in Hawthorne Grove, bringing with it the kind of morning that made promises feel possible. The scent of fresh-cut lumber mixed with the aroma of coffee brewing in Harper's kitchen, and the honeysuckle that grew wild along the back fence. Somewhere nearby, a nail gun fired in steady rhythm, its percussion accompanied by the sound of men's voices calling measurements and encouragements to each other. Nora stood in what had once been her front yard, watching Santos guide a 2x4 into place, while Buddy marked measurements with the careful precision of someone who had learned his craft in harder circumstances than these. The house was rising again, board by board, with the kind of attention to detail that came from men who understood the difference between building shelter and building home. The legal proceedings had moved with surprising speed. Once Detective Santos and the state investigators had taken over the case, Deputy Clerk Morrison had been arrested 3 weeks after the city council meeting. His cooperation with prosecutors leading to the identification of the entire fraud network. The investment company's assets had been frozen, the forged documents officially voided, and 17 families had received clear title to properties they had thought were lost forever. But the rebuilding, emotional and physical, had taken longer. Caleb sat cross-legged in the driveway, carefully organizing screws by size under Buddy's patient supervision. At 6 years old, he had developed an intense concentration that seemed to absorb all the chaos around him and transform it into order. His small hands worked with the methodical care of someone much older, each screw placed precisely where it belonged. "That's right, little man," Buddy encouraged, his scarred knuckles gentle as he showed the boy how to read the markings on different fasteners. Organization is half the battle. Know where everything is, and the work goes smooth. Evan had claimed the more complex task of helping Miguel install windows, his teenage height and steady hands making him useful for work that required precision and patience. He moved with the careful confidence of someone learning skills that would serve him long after this house was finished, absorbing lessons about craftsmanship and responsibility from men who had learned both the hard way. Maisie had appointed herself as official morale officer, moving between workstations with a thermos of lemonade and an inexhaustible supply of encouragement. She wore her father's old baseball cap, its brim nearly covering her eyes, and dispensed advice with the absolute certainty that only 9-year-olds possessed. "Mr. Roberto," she called to the man installing new gutters, "don't forget to eat lunch. Mama says hungry workers make mistakes." Roberto laughed, his hands steady on the ladder, despite the tremor that still affected him during stressful moments. "Yes, boss. I'll remember." The community that had gathered around the Whitford family during their crisis had never really dispersed. Mrs. Chen arrived each morning with homemade soup that somehow always appeared just as the workers were getting hungry. Harper had transformed her kitchen into an unofficial headquarters where progress was tracked. Problems were solved, and stories were shared over endless pots of coffee. Jonas Wexley had become a regular fixture as well, his investigation expanding into a book project that would document not just the fraud that had targeted Hawthorne Grove, but the community response that had defeated it. He sat in Harper's living room now, his laptop balanced on his knees, recording the oral histories of residents who had found their voices in the midst of crisis. "The thing about corruption," he was explaining to his digital recorder, "is that it depends on isolation. It works when people feel like they're facing problems alone, when they don't realize that their individual struggles are part of a larger pattern. What happened here was the opposite of that isolation. It was connection, recognition, solidarity." Santos paused in his work to listen, feeling the weight of words that tried to explain something that had felt both inevitable and impossible. The debt he had owed Derek Whitford could never be fully paid, but it had been transformed into something larger, a commitment to the community that had embraced his efforts at redemption. By afternoon, the house's frame was complete, its skeleton strong and square and ready for the work that would make it whole. Santos stood back to survey their progress, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove. Feeling the satisfaction that came from building rather than destroying, Nora joined him, her hands dusty from the volunteer work she'd been doing inside, preparing surfaces and organizing materials with the focused energy of someone reclaiming her space 1 inch at a time. "Derek would have loved this," she said quietly, watching her children work alongside men who had once been strangers, but were now something approaching family. "He did love it," Santos replied. "That's why we're here." The pendant around Nora's neck caught the afternoon sun, its surface polished to brightness by months of wear and worry and hope. Inside it, Derek's phone number had been replaced with a small photograph, the four of them on Maisie's last birthday, laughing at something Caleb had said, captured in a moment of pure joy that had seemed impossible during the darkest months of Derek's illness. As evening approached, the workers began cleaning up their tools and preparing for tomorrow's tasks. The walls would go up next, then the roof, then the 1,000 details that transformed construction into home. It would take time, but they had time now. The crisis that had brought them together had been resolved. But the connections it had forged were permanent. Harper emerged from her house carrying a tray of fresh cornbread, its aroma drawing the workers toward her porch like a dinner bell. The informal gathering that followed had become a daily tradition. 20 minutes of shared food and conversation that marked the end of the workday and the beginning of evening's quieter pleasures. "You know," Harper said, settling into her porch swing with the contented sigh of someone who had lived long enough to recognize grace when it appeared. "I've been in this neighborhood for 31 years. I've seen families come and go, watched children grow up and move away, buried too many neighbors and welcomed too few new ones." She paused to sip her sweet tea, her eyes taking in the scene before her. Ex-gang members sharing cornbread with elderly immigrants. Children learning construction skills from men who had rebuilt their own lives from rubble. A community that had discovered its own strength in the process of protecting its most vulnerable members. "But I've never seen anything quite like this," she continued. "Never seen people choose each other so deliberately, so permanently. What you've all built here. It's not just a house. It's proof that decent people don't have to face the world's cruelty alone." Santos felt Derek's presence in that moment, as clearly as if his old friend were standing beside them on the porch. Some debts, he realized, were never meant to be paid in full. They were meant to be passed forward, transformed, multiplied until they became something larger than their origins, until they became love in action. Community in practice, hope made manifest in lumber and nails, and the patient work of human hands. As the sun set over Maple Street, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Nora gathered her children close and looked at the house that was rising from the ashes of their loss. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were surrounded by people who had chosen to care for them, protected by men who had learned to transform their hardest lessons into gifts for others. The pendant around her neck felt warm with more than just body heat. It pulsed with the presence of everyone who had ever chosen kindness over indifference, connection over isolation, hope over fear. Derek's legacy was alive and growing, one board at a time. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness. A cup of water offered to a stranger, a phone call made despite fear, a community that chooses to stand together rather than fall separately. In a world that often feels designed to divide us, stories like these remind us that our greatest strength has always been our capacity to care for one another. What small act of kindness could you offer today that might plant seeds for someone else's tomorrow? Would you like another story?